The legacy that broke a heart. Carlos Montero stood at the edge of his grand estate, staring at the city skyline beyond the hills. The mansion, a towering symbol of his success, was built from years of sweat, sacrifice, and ruthless ambition. Everything he had touched had turned into gold, except his marriage. Tonight, the halls of his mansion echoed with silence. No laughter, no conversation, just the faint ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the foyer. A heavy emptiness weighed on him, but Carlos refused to acknowledge it. He was a man obsessed with legacy. The Montero name had to live on. His empire was vast, his wealth endless, yet without an heir, it all felt incomplete, and that had become the single biggest fracture in his marriage to Elena. Elena. The name alone stirred emotions he didn't want to confront. 7 years ago, she had walked into his life like a hurricane, fierce, passionate, and unapologetically intelligent. She wasn't just beautiful, she was sharp, a brilliant lawyer who had challenged him in ways no one else had dared. She had loved him when he was nothing, when he was still clawing his way up from the bottom. And yet, after all these years, after everything they had built together, the one thing she couldn't give him was a child. Carlos gritted his teeth, his mind flashing back to their most recent argument. The breaking point. That evening, they sat at opposite ends of the long dining table. The atmosphere was suffocating. "I saw the fertility specialist today," Elena finally said, her voice cautious, tired. Carlos barely looked up from his meal. "And?" She hesitated. "There's little hope, Carlos. The doctor said we've exhausted almost every option." Carlos' grip tightened around his fork. The words stung. He had already heard them before, but tonight, something inside him snapped. "So that's it," he said, his tone sharp. "You're just giving up." Elena's eyes flashed with pain. "I never gave up. I've gone through every painful procedure, taken every injection, suffered through every false hope. What more do you want from me?" Carlos exhaled sharply. "I want a future. I want an heir, Elena. Someone to carry my name, my empire. I can't build all this just to have it end with me." Her breath hitched. "Is that all I am to you? A means to an heir?" Carlos didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pushed his chair back and stood. "Maybe we were never meant to have a family," he muttered, more to himself than to her. The moment the words left his lips, he knew they had caused irreparable damage. Elena's face went pale, her hands trembling as she set down her glass. She slowly rose from her seat, her voice eerily calm. "Carlos, I have given you everything. And tonight, you've made it clear that none of it was enough." He wanted to take the words back, to tell her he hadn't meant them, but his pride held him back. "Maybe we should stop pretending this is working," he finally said. A single tear slipped down Elena's cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. "I thought love was enough," she whispered. Then she turned and walked away, gone without a trace. The next morning, she was gone. Carlos came home from a business meeting to find the mansion eerily quiet. His chest tightened as he entered their bedroom. The closet doors hung open, half of her clothes missing. The framed wedding photo on their nightstand was gone. And on the kitchen counter, a letter lay waiting. With stiff fingers, Carlos picked it up. "Carlos, I need to find myself again. I hope you find what you're looking for. Elena." His breath hitched. He read the words over and over, hoping to find some hidden meaning in them, some hint that she wasn't really leaving. But the truth was clear. She had walked out of his life, and Carlos had no one to blame but himself. A hollow victory. Weeks turned into months. Carlos drowned himself in work, acquiring businesses, expanding his empire, chasing more. He told himself that money and power would fill the void Elena left behind. But no matter how many millions he made, no matter how many high-profile deals he closed, his nights were haunted by the echo of an empty home. Her scent still lingered in their bedroom. Every room held a memory. Her laughter, her touch, her warmth. And now, nothing. Carlos was a man who had won the world but lost the only thing that ever truly mattered. A year later, the unexpected revelation. One evening, an invitation arrived. It was for a charity gala hosted by one of Elena's former law firms. Normally, Carlos would have ignored such an event, but then he saw the guest list. Elena Montero. His chest tightened. She was going to be there. Carlos had not seen or heard from her in a year. She had vanished from his life completely, refusing to take his calls or respond to his lawyers. And now here she was. He had to see her. The night that changed everything. The gala was held in a grand ballroom in the heart of Barcelona, shimmering chandeliers casting golden light over the elite guests. Carlos arrived, his usual mask of confidence in place. But inwardly, he was a storm of emotions. And then he saw her. Elena stood near the stage, glowing in a sleek emerald dress, talking to a group of high-profile lawyers. But she wasn't alone. She held a baby in her arms. Carlos stopped breathing. And then he noticed the stroller beside her. 2 more babies inside. Triplets. His vision blurred. What was happening? The world around him faded into the background as he made his way toward her. She turned, and their eyes met. For the first time in a year, Carlos saw the woman he had abandoned. But now, she wasn't just his wife. She was the mother of his children. Triplets. His children. His legacy. The weight of everything he had done. Asterisk, asterisk, his mistake. His pride. His abandonment. Asterisk, asterisk, came crashing down on him like a tidal wave. And in that moment, Carlos Montero realized the truth. He had never truly lost everything. He had just been blind to what really mattered. The weight of regret. Carlos Montero stood frozen, the elegant chatter and clinking glasses of the gala fading into a distant hum. His sharp, business-hardened mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Elena. Asterisk, asterisk, his wife, the woman he had driven away. Asterisk, asterisk, stood before him, cradling a child in her arms. Beside her, a luxurious stroller held 2 more babies. Triplets. His breath caught in his throat. His world, meticulously crafted with logic and control, tilted on its axis. These were his children. For a moment, disbelief warred with reality. Had she? No, it didn't make sense. They had been told there was no hope. He had walked away believing that their future as parents was impossible. Yet here she was, holding his legacy in her arms. A tense reunion. Elena had seen him. Her expression did not mirror the shock and confusion that gripped Carlos. No, her eyes were calm, strong, guarded. Elena. His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. She turned fully toward him, shifting the infant in her arms. The little girl nestled closer to her, a tiny hand gripping the fabric of Elena's emerald dress. Carlos, she said evenly. The distance between them felt unbearable. Carlos took a step closer, his gaze bouncing between her and the children. When? His voice was hoarse, his usually commanding presence faltering. How? Elena's lips pressed together. She glanced around the ballroom, where onlookers had begun to take notice of their interaction. Their past was a public spectacle, and now their reunion was as well. This isn't the time or place, she said, her tone clipped. Carlos clenched his fists. He had 1,000 questions clawing at his throat, but she was right. This was not a conversation for the gala floor. Still, he couldn't let her leave. Not again. Please, he said, lowering his voice. Just give me a moment. I deserve that much. Elena studied him for a long moment before signing. Fine. Follow me. The truth unfolds. They stepped into a quiet terrace overlooking the glittering Barcelona skyline. The cool night air was a stark contrast to the heat burning in Carlos's chest. Elena set the baby back into the stroller, adjusting a soft blanket around her tiny frame before turning to face him fully. You left, she said, no malice in her voice, just simple, unshakable truth. And I let you go. I wasn't going to chase after a man who didn't want this family. Carlos flinched. She cut him off. And then, after you were gone, I found out I was pregnant. His stomach clenched. You knew, and you didn't tell me. Her jaw tightened. Tell you. A humorless laugh escaped her lips. After you told me we were never meant to have a family. After you looked me in the eye and said maybe this was where we should stop. Carlos's gut twisted. Those words had been spoken in frustration, in desperation, but now they were chains binding him to regret. I was scared, she continued. Scared of doing it alone. Scared of what bringing them into the world without a father would mean. But you made it clear, Carlos. He swallowed hard. I didn't know. You didn't want to know, Elena countered. A sharp silence stretched between them. Carlos dragged a hand down his face, trying to piece together the shattered fragments of his choices. They're mine. Yes, Elena said. And they're everything to me. His gaze dropped to the sleeping babies. His babies. A boy and 2 girls. Their faces were soft, peaceful, utterly unaware of the weight of this moment. How much had he missed? Their first smiles. Their first words. Their first time reaching for their mother's embrace. An ache settled deep in his bones. He had walked away from this. And yet, they existed. They were his. And he had no idea how to fix the damage he had done. A father's plea. Carlos took a deep breath. I want to be in their lives. Elena's expression remained unreadable. It's not that simple. Then tell me how. He stepped closer, his hands tightening at his sides. Tell me what I have to do. I can't walk away again, Elena. She let out a slow breath. You say that now, but what happens when your empire demands more of you? When your meetings and your deals take priority over bedtime stories and scraped knees? Carlos shook his head. I can change. I will change. Elena's gaze softened slightly, but there was still doubt in her eyes. The triplets don't know you, she said. You can't just walk in and expect to play the role of a father overnight. It takes more than showing up once to prove you care. Carlos nodded, absorbing her words. I want to earn that right, he said, his voice firm. I'll do whatever it takes. Name it. Elena exhaled, rubbing her temples as though battling an internal war. After a long pause, she finally spoke. Start small, she said. Visits, time with them. Let them see who you are. It was a fragile offer, but it was a chance. Carlos seized it. Thank you, he murmured, his voice thick with something he hadn't felt in years. Humility. A new beginning or a final warning. As Carlos left the gala that night, his mind was a battlefield of emotions. His life, his carefully controlled, empire-driven world, had just exploded in the most unexpected way. He had children, 3 of them. And if he had any hope of reclaiming them, of reclaiming her, he had to fight harder than he ever had before. This wasn't a business deal he could negotiate. This was his family. And for the first time in his life, he was truly afraid of losing something he couldn't replace. A father's trial begins. Carlos Montero had always been a man who could control the world around him. Money, power, influence. He had bent them all to his will. But the love of his children, the trust of the woman he had abandoned, that was a battle he had never fought before, and he had no idea if he could win. First steps toward redemption. The day after the gala, Carlos sat alone in his vast, empty mansion. For the first time in years, his empire felt worthless. The wealth, the prestige, the high-powered deals, it all meant nothing compared to the realization that 3 tiny lives existed without him. And it was his own fault. Elena had agreed to let him see them. But under her conditions, she had made it clear, this would not be easy. You don't get to walk in and play father because it suits you now, she had said. This isn't about what you want, Carlos. It's about them. Those words haunted him as he sat staring at the fireplace, whiskey untouched in his hand. He had to prove himself. Not with money, not with gifts. with time, with presence, with love. And for a man who had spent his life believing success was measured in power and deals, this was a terrifyingly unfamiliar battlefield. The first meeting. A week later, he stood outside Alina's modest home, his heart pounding in a way it never had before. He had faced billion-dollar boardrooms. He had negotiated with the most ruthless tycoons. But knocking on his estranged wife's door to meet his children, he felt like a man standing before a battlefield he wasn't ready for. The door swung open, and there she was. Alina looked at him with measured caution, dressed in a comfortable sweater and jeans, her hair in a loose ponytail. She was still breathtaking. But more than that, she looked like a woman who had carried the weight of the world alone. "You're on time," she said, arching an eyebrow. Carlos swallowed. "I said I'd be here." She studied him for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." His heart pounded as he stepped inside the warm, cozy house. It was nothing like the cold, extravagant mansion he lived in. It smelled of vanilla and baby powder. There were toys scattered on the floor, a soft lullaby playing in the background. It felt like a home. And then he saw them. 3 small figures sat in the playpen near the couch, babbling to each other. His breath caught. They were so small, so innocent. The boy, Gabriel, was stacking blocks with intense focus. The eldest girl, Sophia, was scribbling on a piece of paper with colored pencils. And the youngest, Lucia, was chewing on her fingers, watching her siblings. They looked just like her, and yet he could see himself in them too. His blood, his legacy, his children. For the first time in his life, Carlos Montero had no idea what to do. A stranger to his own blood. Alina moved past him, walking toward the triplets. "Babies," she said in that gentle, motherly tone he had never heard before. "Say hello to Carlos." Not Daddy. Carlos. It was a reminder. He was a stranger to them. His heart clenched, but he nodded. He had to earn that title. He slowly knelt beside the playpen, his expensive suit feeling completely out of place in this world of soft blankets and stuffed animals. "Hi," he said awkwardly. The children stared at him. Lucia immediately hid her face in Alina's leg. Sophia blinked at him curiously, but didn't say anything. And Gabriel, the little boy, frowned, clutched his toy truck, and turned away. Carlos swallowed. They didn't know him. And why would they? He had been absent for an entire year. Alina watched the scene with an unreadable expression. They're shy around new people. Of course, Carlos murmured, his heart aching. He was new to his own children. But then, the tiniest fingers reached out toward him. Lucia, still half hiding behind Alina, stretched her chubby hand toward his. Carlos froze. His entire world narrowed down to that single hesitant movement. He lifted his hand slowly, gently brushing her tiny fingers with his. Lucia giggled. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, the hardest challenge of his life. That first meeting lasted only an hour. Carlos sat on the floor, listening to Alina as she told him about the children's routines, their favorite foods, their first words. Sophia loved painting. Gabriel was fascinated by toy cars. Lucia was the most attached to Alina, never wanting to leave her side. And he had missed all of it. By the time he left, his heart was a heavy knot in his chest. Alina stood at the doorway, her arms crossed. "You did okay," she admitted. Carlos exhaled. "What do I have to do to see them again?" She studied him for a long moment. "Come back next Saturday," she said finally. "But don't be late. And don't bring gifts. They don't need toys. They need consistency." Carlos nodded. "I'll be here." And for the first time in his life, he meant it more than anything. One visit wasn't enough. One visit became 2. 2 became 4. Each Saturday, Carlos arrived at Alina's house, no longer wearing the armor of his business suits but dressed casually, blending into their world. At first, the children remained wary. Gabriel ignored him. Sophia only spoke in small words. Lucia still clung to Elena. But Carlos refused to give up. He learned how to change diapers. He learned how to read bedtime stories. He learned how to sit on the floor and just be present. One evening, as he was getting ready to leave, Sophia surprised him by running to the door. "Bye-bye," she said, waving her tiny hand. Carlos's throat tightened. It was the first time she had acknowledged him. The first crack in the walls between them. The road to forgiveness. Elena still kept her distance. She never encouraged the children to call him Dad. She never smiled too much in his direction. She was watching, waiting, testing him. And Carlos knew it. One evening, as he was helping Gabriel build a tower of blocks, Elena stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "They're getting used to you," she admitted. Carlos looked up. "And you?" Elena's lips pressed into a thin line. "You hurt me, Carlos." His chest ached. "I know." Her voice softened. "But they need you. And I won't take that from them." Carlos met her gaze, determination burning in his eyes. "I won't let them down," he vowed. For once in his life, Carlos Montero wasn't fighting for money, for power, or for an empire. He was fighting for something far more important. His children, his family, and he wasn't going to lose them again. Earning the title of father, Carlos Montero had built an empire from nothing. He had conquered industries, shattered competitors, and made his name one of the most feared in the corporate world. But none of that had prepared him for the battle he was facing now, earning the love of 3 tiny souls who had no idea he was their father. Consistency over wealth. Carlos had expected that winning his children's trust would be a matter of time. He had been wrong. Weeks turned into months, and progress was painfully slow. Lucia, the youngest, had warmed up to him the quickest. She would giggle when he tickled her feet and let him hold her for short periods before reaching back for Elena. Sophia had started responding to him, but only in simple nods or single words. Gabriel, the only boy, was the hardest to reach. He rarely looked at Carlos, often turning away when he entered the room. The little boy seemed to resent his presence. Carlos didn't blame him. He hadn't been there. He had spent a year pretending they didn't exist, convincing himself that his choice had been the right one. But the cold, hard truth was that he had abandoned them, and now he had to prove to them that he wouldn't leave again. The first real connection. It was a rainy afternoon when the breakthrough finally happened. Carlos had arrived for his usual visit, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, something Elena had insisted on. "You're not here as a businessman," she had said. "You're here as their father." The triplets were playing in the living room. Lucia was busy trying to stack blocks that kept falling over. Sophia was coloring. Gabriel, however, was sitting in the corner with his toy cars. Carlos hesitated before sitting down on the floor next to him. "That's a nice car," he said casually. The boy ignored him. Carlos took a deep breath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old toy car, faded with time. "I had this when I was a little boy," he said, rolling it on the floor. "It was my favorite." Gabriel finally looked at him, his small eyebrows furrowed. "You were little?" he asked, his voice doubtful. Carlos felt like he had just won a war. He nodded. "Yep, and I loved cars, just like you." Gabriel hesitated. Then, slowly, he pushed his car toward Carlos. It was a test. Carlos pushed it back. For the next 20 minutes, they said nothing. They just rolled the cars back and forth, an unspoken understanding forming between them. It was small. It was fragile. But it was the first real connection Carlos had made with his son. Elena, watching from the kitchen, said nothing. But when he caught her looking, there was a softness in her gaze that hadn't been there before. Carlos faces his first challenge as a father. A week later, Carlos was thrown into his first real fatherly test. Lucia had a high fever. Carlos arrived at Elena's house as usual, but instead of being greeted with a cautious smile, he was met with chaos. Lucia was crying in Elena's arms, her tiny face red with fever. Gabriel and Sophia stood nearby, looking worried. Carlos's heart dropped. "What happened?" he asked, stepping forward. Elena didn't answer right away. She was exhausted, her hair a mess, her face filled with worry. "She's been burning up since last night. I tried everything." Carlos swallowed hard. "Have you called the doctor?" "Yes," Elena sighed. "They said to monitor her fever and bring her in if it gets worse." Carlos hesitated, then made a bold move. "Give her to me," he said. Elena blinked. "What?" Carlos stepped closer, holding out his arms. "Let me help." She hesitated. It was one thing to let him visit. It was another thing entirely to trust him with their sick child. But she was exhausted, and something in Carlos's eyes told her he wouldn't leave. Slowly, she handed Lucia over. Carlos felt the tiny weight of his daughter in his arms, her small body burning with fever. And suddenly, the reality of fatherhood hit him like never before. This wasn't about proving himself anymore. This was about taking care of his children because they needed him. Carlos spent the next few hours rocking Lucia in his arms, cooling her forehead with a damp cloth, and humming softly even though he had never sung a lullaby in his life. By midnight, her fever finally broke. Elena stood nearby, watching him with an unreadable expression. "You did good," she finally murmured. Carlos looked down at Lucia, now sleeping peacefully in his arms, and realized something. For the first time in his life, he had done something that truly mattered. The media threatens their peace. Carlos was starting to believe that, maybe, just maybe, he had a chance at becoming the father his children deserved. But the past had a way of catching up. A few weeks later, a tabloid article exploded across the internet. "Billionaire Carlos Montero's secret family exposed. Who is the mother?" Elena's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Carlos saw the article while sitting in his office. His blood ran cold. Someone had leaked the story. Someone had dragged Elena and the triplets into his world. And he knew exactly who was behind it. Carlos's past comes back to haunt him. Carlos stormed into his office, his assistant barely able to keep up. "Who leaked this?" he demanded. His head of security, Robert, hesitated. "We traced it back to someone inside the company. A former board member who wasn't happy about your departure." Carlos's hands clenched into fists. He had been slowly pulling away from his empire, spending less time at the company and more time with his children. Some people hadn't liked that. And now, they had used the media to drag his family into the spotlight. Carlos didn't hesitate. "Fire them," he said coldly, "and release a statement." "Sir, what should the statement say?" Carlos turned, his jaw set. "Say that my children and their mother are off limits, and if anyone touches them, they will regret it. Elena's trust is tested again." That night, Carlos went to Elena's house. She was furious. "Do you see now?" she snapped. "This is exactly why I didn't want you involved. Your world is dangerous, Carlos. And now, my children are in the headlines." Carlos had no defense, because she was right. But he also knew one thing: he would do anything to protect them. "Elena," he said, his voice steady, "I will make this right." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I don't know if you can." Carlos stepped closer. "You said before that actions matter more than words. Then let me prove to you that I can keep them safe." Elena looked at him for a long time. Then, finally, she nodded. One last chance. Carlos had fought wars in the boardroom. But this was the biggest battle of his life. And he wasn't going to lose. A father's vow. Carlos had fought in the cutthroat world of business, navigating betrayals and corporate warfare. But this battle, the battle for his family, was unlike anything he had ever faced. And now, with Elena's trust hanging by a thread, and the media storm threatening to consume their fragile progress, he had to act. He had to prove that he wasn't just a father by blood, but by action. A public stand for his family. The following morning, headlines flooded every news site and social media feed. "Billionaire Carlos Montero's secret children. Scandal or redemption. Elena Montero, the woman who hid his heirs. The Montero triplets. What the world didn't know. Carlos saw red. This wasn't just an invasion of his privacy. This was an attack on Elena and their children. He immediately called a press conference. Elena was hesitant when he told her his plan. "You think making a statement will fix this?" she asked, arms crossed, eyes filled with doubt. "The media doesn't care about the truth, Carlos. They care about selling stories." Carlos met her gaze. "Then I'll make them listen." She sighed. "Fine. Do whatever you think will help. But don't make promises you can't keep." Her words cut deep, because he had made promises before and broken them. But this time, he would stand by his word. The press conference that changed everything. A crowd of reporters gathered in a grand conference hall, cameras flashing as Carlos Montero stepped up to the podium. He adjusted the microphone and looked out over the sea of faces. He had controlled his public image for years, but never like this. "Good afternoon," he began, his deep voice carrying authority. "I am here to address the rumors that have been circulating about my personal life." The room went silent. He was known for being ruthless in business, cold, strategic, untouchable. But today, he was speaking not as a CEO, but as a man who had failed the people he loved. "Yes," he continued, "the reports are true. I have 3 children, triplets, and their mother is Elena Montero, my wife." The murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked furiously. Carlos raised a hand, silencing the noise. "My children are not a scandal. They are my greatest blessing." A heavy pause. "For years, I put my career above everything else. I let my ambition blind me to what truly mattered. And in doing so, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I walked away from the woman I loved and the family I didn't even know I had." Elena, watching from her home, felt her breath hitch. Carlos wasn't just protecting them. He was admitting his faults in front of the entire world. "I will not allow my children or their mother to be harassed by the media," Carlos continued. "They are not public property. I demand that their privacy be respected." His eyes hardened. "And to those who think they can use my family against me, know this: there is nothing I will not do to protect them." His statement was clear. Carlos Montero was not just a businessman anymore. He was a father. Elena's walls began to crack. That evening, Carlos arrived at Elena's home, expecting another battle. Instead, she opened the door and simply stared at him. "You really did it," she murmured. Carlos exhaled. "I meant what I said, Elena. No more hiding, no more running." She studied him for a long time. Then, to his shock, she stepped aside. "Come in," she said. Carlos blinked. "What?" "You're their father," she said, quieter this time. "And you proved today that you're not ashamed of them. So, come in." For a moment, Carlos couldn't breathe. This wasn't a victory. This was an invitation. To try, to prove, to be the man he should have been all along. He stepped inside, feeling hope for the first time in years. A moment of peace, and a new challenge. That night, Carlos helped Elena put the triplets to bed. Lucia curled up against him, her tiny fingers gripping his shirt. Gabriel let him tuck the blanket around him. A silent acceptance. Sofia, ever the cautious one, hesitated. But when Carlos reached out his hand, she placed hers in his for just a moment. Carlos felt something shift deep inside him. This was real. This was fatherhood. As he stood in the doorway, watching Elena smooth back Lucia's hair, he whispered, "Thank you for letting me be here." Elena didn't look at him, but she nodded. It was the smallest sign of forgiveness. And for Carlos, it was everything. The shadows of the past are not done yet. Just as Carlos was beginning to feel like he was earning his place in their lives, a storm was brewing. A week later, he received a call. His head of security, Robert, sounded urgent. "Sir, we have a problem." Carlos frowned. What kind of problem? There was a pause. The media leak wasn't just a one-time thing. Someone is digging deeper into your past, and they'd found something damaging. Carlos's blood ran cold. He had spent years in business. He had made enemies. And now someone was using his past against him. What did they find? He asked, his voice dangerously calm. Robert hesitated. A scandal from years ago. Something connected to one of your first business takeovers. It's not illegal, but if the public finds out. Carlos closed his eyes. His past sins were coming back to haunt him. And this time, it wasn't just his reputation at stake. It was his family. The coming storm. Carlos had two choices. He could try to cover it up, or he could face it head-on, like he had with Alina. And for the first time in his life, he knew the right choice. No more lies. No more running. He wasn't just protecting his business anymore. He was protecting his children's future. Carlos Montero had built an empire. Now, he would fight to keep his family together, even if it meant tearing down everything else. A father's reckoning. Carlos Montero had built a fortune out of nothing. He had risen from a life of struggle, clawing his way to the top, making calculated risks and ruthless decisions along the way. And now, his past was coming to destroy everything. His children, his second chance with Alina, the fragile foundation of trust he had only just begun to rebuild. And this time, he couldn't just buy his way out. The scandal that could ruin him. Carlos sat in his office, jaw tight, hands clasped together. Across from him, Robert, his trusted head of security, was silent. "You said someone was digging into my past," Carlos said, his voice dangerously calm. "What exactly did they find?" Robert hesitated. Then he slid a file across the desk. Carlos opened it. His stomach twisted. Inside were documents, photos, financial reports, all connected to one of his earliest business acquisitions. A hostile takeover. The kind that left people ruined. The kind that made enemies. Carlos had been young and hungry back then, willing to crush anyone in his way. And now someone wanted revenge. "This is going public?" Carlos asked, voice tight. Robert nodded. "The journalist investigating it isn't just some gossip reporter. He's one of the best. He's got evidence, Carlos. They'll frame you as the villain, a billionaire who crushed small businesses for his empire. If this leaks..." "I know," Carlos cut in. "It wouldn't just be a scandal. It would be a stain that could never be erased. And the worst part, Alina would see it. She had spent her life fighting for justice in the legal world. What would she think when she saw what he had done? Would she take the children and leave for good? Would she decide that no matter how much he was trying to change, he wasn't worthy of being in their lives?" Carlos felt fear for the first time in years. Not fear for his reputation, not for his money, but fear that he was about to lose the only thing that truly mattered. A desperate attempt at control. Carlos knew how the media worked. There was one way to control a story. Get ahead of it. "Schedule an interview," he told Robert. "I'll tell my side before they release the story." Robert frowned. "Carlos, are you sure? Once you admit to this, there's no going back." Carlos exhaled. He had spent years trying to bury his mistakes, but now he had to own them. "I can't afford to lose my family," he said, his voice steady. "No more lies. No more hiding. Let's do this. A public confession." 3 days later, Carlos sat in front of a news anchor, cameras rolling. The world was watching. Alina was watching. His children, too young to understand, would one day read about this moment. And so, Carlos told the truth. "I was ruthless," he admitted. "When I was younger, I thought success meant eliminating competition. I made choices that hurt people, and I regret that." The interviewer leaned in. "Do you believe you deserve forgiveness?" Carlos's throat tightened. He thought of Alina's tired, guarded eyes, Gabriel's cautious stares, Sophia's hesitance, Lucia's small, fragile trust. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, "but I'll spend the rest of my life proving I changed." The interview ended, and then all he could do was wait. Elena's judgment. That night, Carlos drove to Elena's house. His hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly. His stomach churned in a way it never had before, not even before his biggest business deals. When he knocked, Elena opened the door, holding a cup of tea. She didn't invite him in. But she didn't close the door in his face either. "You saw it?" Carlos asked, voice rough. Elena nodded. "I did." Silence stretched between them. Then, "You didn't try to cover it up," she murmured. Carlos exhaled. "I couldn't." She studied him. The old Carlos would have. He swallowed hard. The old Carlos didn't have 3 kids who look at him like a stranger. Elena's eyes softened. For the first time, Carlos saw something in her gaze that wasn't just caution or pain. It was the smallest flicker of belief, a new kind of battle. Carlos didn't know what forgiveness looked like, but he knew what effort looked like. And so, he showed up, every day. Not just on Saturdays, but on weekdays too. He learned how to feed them, change them, bathe them. He learned how to comfort them when they cried. Gabriel still held back, but he no longer turned away. Sophia started telling him about her drawings. Lucia, sweet, innocent Lucia, started falling asleep in his arms. The house became less tense when he was there. Elena smiled more. And then, one evening, it happened. As Carlos was getting ready to leave, Sophia ran to him and hugged his leg. "Bye, Daddy," she said cheerfully. Carlos froze. His heart stopped. "Daddy." Elena, standing by the sink, covered her mouth with her hand. Gabriel and Lucia turned, watching. Carlos slowly, carefully knelt down. "You called me Daddy," he whispered. Sophia nodded. "Are you?" Carlos felt something break inside him. A wall he had built so long ago. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said softly. "I am." Sophia beamed and ran back to her toys. Lucia clapped. Gabriel hesitated. Then, in a small voice, he said, "Night, Daddy." Carlos felt like he had just won the biggest war of his life. Elena said nothing, but when she looked at him, her eyes were shining. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally becoming the man they needed. But the battle wasn't over yet. Just as Carlos was beginning to hope, disaster struck. A phone call. A voice filled with panic. "Sir, it's your company. They're launching a takeover. If you don't act now, you'll lose everything." Carlos clenched his jaw. He had a choice. Go back to fight for his empire, or stay and fight for his family. And for the first time in his life, the answer was clear. The ultimate choice. Carlos Montero had spent his entire life fighting. Fighting for wealth. Fighting for power. Fighting to carve his name into the world so it would never be forgotten. But now, for the first time ever, he had to decide what was truly worth fighting for. His empire was crumbling. His past mistakes had come back, not just in the form of media scandals, but as a hostile takeover. His board, once loyal to him, was turning against him. The very empire he had built with blood, sweat, and ruthless ambition was being stolen from under him. And the worst part, he didn't care about the company anymore. He cared about his family. The phone call that changed everything. Carlos sat in his car outside Elena's house, staring at his phone. His top advisor, Andrew Delgado, was on the line. "Carlos, we need you back at headquarters." Andrew's voice was urgent. "The investors are panicking. If you don't fight back, the company is gone." Carlos exhaled slowly. There was a time when this news would have sent him racing to his office, ready to crush his enemies. Now he looked toward the warm light coming from inside the house, where his children were waiting for him. And suddenly, his empire didn't feel so important anymore. "What's the plan?" Carlos finally asked. Andrew hesitated. "You have 2 choices. Either you step in and fight, taking back control through an aggressive counter-move, or you walk away. Carlos closed his eyes. For years, his name had been synonymous with power. People feared him, respected him. But what had it all been for? He had already lost Elena once. He had already missed the first year of his children's lives. Was he really about to make the same mistake again? His fingers hovered over the steering wheel. Then he made his choice. "Sell my shares," he said quietly. There was a stunned silence on the other end. "Carlos, are you sure?" Carlos nodded, even though no one could see him. "Yes, I'm done." And just like that, he let it go. A legacy rebuilt. Carlos stepped inside Elena's house, shaking off the weight of his past. Elena glanced up from the kitchen. "Everything okay?" Carlos nodded, walking toward the living room, where the triplets were playing. Gabriel was rolling his toy car across the floor. Sofia was coloring. Lucia was curled up with a book. This was what mattered. He sat down next to them, rolling the car back to Gabriel. The little boy hesitated, then pushed it back. Carlos smiled. Every day, the walls between them cracked a little more. "Daddy, look at my drawing," Sofia said, holding up a crayon sketch of a family. Carlos's heart clenched. It was a picture of Elena, the triplets, and him. He swallowed hard. "It's perfect, sweetheart." Sofia grinned and went back to coloring. Lucia crawled into his lap, curling against him. Gabriel, after a long moment, leaned against his side. And just like that, Carlos felt something he had never felt before. Peace. Elena's final decision. That night, as the kids slept, Carlos helped Elena clean up. For the first time in years, their movements were easy, comfortable, like they used to be. She finally broke the silence. "So, what happens now?" Carlos dried a dish, then set it down. "I left the company." Elena turned sharply. "You what?" "I walked away," Carlos said simply. "I spent my whole life building that empire, and I thought it was my legacy. But I was wrong." Elena's lips parted slightly, as if struggling to believe him. "Carlos, your company was your life." Carlos stepped closer. "No, you and the kids are my life. Everything else was just noise." She stared at him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she reached out and touched his hand. For the first time since he had walked away from their marriage, Elena was letting him in again. "You're really staying," she whispered. Carlos squeezed her hand. "I'm never leaving again." And then, Elena stepped forward and rested her head against his chest. For Carlos, it was the first time in years that he felt truly at home. A new beginning. A month later, Carlos stood in the backyard, watching his children play. Elena walked up beside him, holding a cup of coffee. "You still haven't told me what you're going to do now," she said. Carlos exhaled, watching the triplets chase each other. "Start over." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Doing what?" Carlos glanced at her, then smiled. "I was thinking, maybe a family business." Elena blinked, then laughed softly. "Carlos Montero, running a small business." He grinned. "Why not? Something simple, something I can pass on to the kids, something that doesn't take me away from them." Elena studied him for a long moment. Then, to his complete shock, she reached up and kissed his cheek. Carlos went completely still. When she pulled away, she was smiling softly. "I think that's the best idea you've ever had." Carlos let out a breath, his heart racing. For the first time in his life, he had made the right choice, and he wasn't going to waste another second. Because this was his real legacy, his family, his future, and this time, he wasn't letting go. A legacy of love. Carlos Montero had spent his life believing that legacy was built on wealth, power, and influence. But as he stood in the backyard, watching his 3 children chase fireflies under the soft glow of the setting sun, he realized the truth. His legacy wasn't the empire he built. It was the family he almost lost. And now he was ready to build something new. A future worth fighting for. Carlos and Elena spent the next few months adjusting to a new kind of life. One where Carlos wasn't running from meeting to meeting, where his days weren't filled with corporate battles, and where his time was measured in bedtime stories and afternoon picnics instead of profit margins. He had left behind an empire, but he had gained something far more valuable. His children now knew him. Sofia no longer hesitated before running to him, proudly showing off her drawings. Gabriel no longer turned away when Carlos entered the room. He now reached for his hand when they walked to the park together. Lucia, always the smallest and most attached, now fell asleep in his arms every night, her tiny hand wrapped around his shirt. And Elena had begun to trust him again. There were no grand declarations, no sudden romantic moments, but there was something even better. There was time. Time to mend the wounds. Time to prove that he wasn't going to walk away again. And Carlos embraced every second of it. A business, a family, a new beginning. True to his word, Carlos never returned to his old world. Instead, he and Elena opened a small family-run business. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't global, but it was theirs. A cozy cafe by the coast, where families gathered, where the triplets played in the backyard while their parents worked together. Carlos, once feared in boardrooms, now spent his mornings making coffee and greeting customers. Elena, once a high-powered attorney, handled the books and organized community events. And in this simple life, they found peace. They found home. A love rekindled. One evening, after the cafe had closed for the night, and the children were asleep, Carlos stood on the porch, watching the waves crash against the shore. Elena joined him, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then softly, she said, "I never thought we'd get here." Carlos turned to her. "Neither did I." She took a deep breath. "I was afraid to let you back in. I was afraid that if I did, you'd leave again." Carlos swallowed hard. "I was afraid too." Elena turned to face him fully, searching his eyes. And now, Carlos reached for her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "I will never leave again, Elena," he promised. "Not now. Not ever." A tear slipped down her cheek. And this time, she didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped forward and kissed him. It was soft, hesitant, but real. And as Carlos pulled her into his arms, he knew. He had finally come home. The true legacy. Years later, when Carlos looked back at his life, he didn't remember the boardrooms. He didn't remember the headlines, the money, or the power. He remembered Sofia running to him with a new painting. He remembered Gabriel's first time riding a bike, when he turned and proudly yelled, "Did you see that, Dad?" He remembered Lucia falling asleep on his chest, her tiny breaths steady and warm. And he remembered Elena standing beside him, laughing, happy, in love again. That was his legacy. Not an empire, a family. And this time, he never let them go.